The Mojave Desert breathes with a rhythm older than memory, its vast expanse stretching like a sea of bronze beneath an unforgiving sun. Here, where Joshua trees stand sentinel over endless miles of sand and stone, survival depends not on wealth or status, but on understanding the delicate balance between life and death that governs this ancient land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Elizabeth Patterson had never imagined she would find herself in such a place. At 26, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that belonged in Boston drawing rooms rather than the harsh wilderness of California territory. Her auburn hair, now disheveled and matted with dust, had once been carefully arranged by ladies' maids. Her pale hands, now raw and bleeding, had known only silk gloves and piano keys. The wagon train she had joined in Independence, Missouri, was supposed to deliver her safely to her intended husband in Los Angeles. Jonathan Morrison was a successful merchant she had never met, chosen by her father to settle mounting family debts through a carefully arranged marriage contract. The journey west was meant to be the final chapter of her controlled, predictable life before beginning another equally controlled existence as a merchant's wife. But the desert had other plans. The trouble began when their wagon master, a weathered man named Coleman Hayes, decided to take what he called a shortcut through unmarked territory. Hayes claimed intimate knowledge of hidden water sources and safer passages that would save them weeks of travel time. What he didn't reveal was his growing desperation to reach Los Angeles before his gambling debts caught up with him, or his increasing dependence on the whiskey that helped him forget the wrong turns and missed landmarks that were becoming more frequent with each passing day. Sarah had noticed the changes in their guide's behavior over the past week. Hayes had become irritable and secretive, consulting maps that seemed to contradict each other, making decisions that confused even his most experienced drivers. When other travelers questioned his route choices, he responded with anger rather than explanation, insisting that his knowledge of the territory was beyond dispute. The wagon train consisted of 12 families, 43 souls seeking new lives in California's promised abundance. There was the Kowalski family from Chicago, Polish immigrants hoping to establish a bakery in San Francisco. The elderly Thornton couple, retired teachers planning to open a school for minors' children. Young Marcus Webb, barely 18, carrying his dead father's tools and dreams of striking it rich in the goldfields. All of them trusted Coleman Hayes to guide them safely through the wilderness. All of them believed his confident assurances that he had traveled these routes countless times before. None of them realized that their guide was leading them deeper into unmapped territory with each passing mile, driven by desperation and clouded judgment. Sarah's traveling companion was her cousin, Rebecca Hamilton, a sharp-eyed woman of 32 who had agreed to accompany Sarah to California in exchange for passage money and the promise of employment in Jonathan Morrison's household. Rebecca possessed the practical intelligence that Sarah's sheltered upbringing had never encouraged, and she was the first to voice concerns about their increasingly erratic route. "We should have reached the Kern River 2 days ago," Rebecca observed quietly as they made camp on what Hayes insisted was their final night before reaching civilization. "I've been tracking our direction with the compass my father gave me, and we're traveling south when we should be heading west." Sarah glanced toward the guide's campfire, where Hayes sat apart from the other travelers, drinking steadily from a bottle that never seemed to empty. "Perhaps he knows alternate routes that aren't marked on standard maps," she suggested, though doubt had been growing in her own mind. "Perhaps," Rebecca replied, but her tone suggested she believed otherwise. "Or perhaps we're lost, and he's too proud or too drunk to admit it." Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices from the direction of Hayes's fire. Marcus Webb was confronting the guide about their dwindling water supplies and the apparent absence of the reliable sources Hayes had promised. The young man's accusations were met with increasing hostility from Hayes, whose slurred words and unsteady posture revealed the extent of his drinking. "You are questioning my knowledge of this country, boy?" Hayes demanded, rising to his feet with dangerous instability. "I've been guiding folks through this desert since before you were weaned from your mama's milk." "Then where are the water sources you promised?" Marcus shot back. "Where are the landmarks you said we'd see? We've been rationing water for 3 days, based on your assurances that fresh supplies were just ahead." The confrontation escalated quickly, drawing other travelers who shared Marcus's concerns. The Kowalski family's patriarch, Jan, supported the young man's questions with his own observations about their diminishing supplies. Elizabeth Thornton, despite her advanced age, added her voice to those demanding clearer explanations of their route and destination. Hayes responded to their united concerns with increasing paranoia and rage. His years of guiding had been built on unquestioned authority, and the challenge to his expertise struck at the core of his professional identity. More dangerously, their questions forced him to confront the possibility that his shortcuts had become dead ends, that his familiarity with the territory was less complete than he had claimed. The situation reached a breaking point when Rebecca produced her compass and began comparing their actual direction of travel with the route Hayes claimed to be following. Her mathematical precision and methodical approach exposed discrepancies that could no longer be explained by alternative routes or local variations in magnetic declination. According to this compass and the position of the North Star, Rebecca announced to the gathered travelers, "We have been traveling southeast for the past 4 days, not west toward Los Angeles. If Mr. Hayes's estimates of our speed are correct, we are now at least 60 miles south of any established trail." The revelation struck the wagon train like lightning. Families who had trusted their lives and futures to Hayes's guidance suddenly realized they were lost in one of the most dangerous territories in North America, with water supplies running dangerously low and no clear route back to known trails. Hayes's response to this exposure was swift and violent. Rather than acknowledge his mistakes or work with the travelers to find solutions, he chose to eliminate the source of his humiliation. That night, while the camp slept fitfully under the desert stars, Hayes made a decision that would transform him from a failed guide to something far worse. Sarah was awakened by rough hands dragging her from her bedroll. In the moonlight, she could see Hayes standing over her with a rifle, his eyes wild with drink and desperation. Rebecca lay motionless nearby, blood trickling from a head wound where she had been struck while trying to defend her cousin. "You women started this trouble," Hayes hissed, his words thick with whiskey and rage. "Questioning my authority, turning good folks against me with your compass tricks and mathematical nonsense. Time you learned what happens to troublemakers in the desert." Sarah tried to scream, but Hayes pressed a dirty cloth against her mouth. While binding her hands with rough rope, her attempts to struggle were hampered by the confusion of sudden awakening and the terror of finding herself completely helpless in the grip of a man who had clearly abandoned all pretense of civilization. The guide dragged her away from the sleeping camp toward a cluster of barrel cacti that dotted the desert floor like ancient sentinels. These massive plants, some over 6 feet tall and covered with thousands of razor-sharp spines, represented one of the desert's most formidable natural hazards. A single wrong step could drive spines deep into human flesh, causing agonizing wounds that festered quickly in the dry heat. Hayes had chosen his punishment with cruel calculation. The barrel cacti were positioned far enough from camp that Sarah's cries would not wake the other travelers, but close enough that her fate would serve as a warning to anyone else who might question his authority. The psychological effect on The wagon train would be devastating, ensuring their continued obedience through fear rather than respect. Working with the methodical precision of someone who had clearly planned this action, Hayes secured Sarah between two of the largest cacti. He used additional rope to bind her arms to the spiny trunks, positioning her so that any movement would drive the needle-sharp barbs deeper into her flesh. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but Hayes was not finished with his cruelty. "Desertal, I'll teach you respect," he muttered, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "The sun comes up in a few hours. It gets mighty hot out here during the day. Folks die of thirst real quick when they can't move to find shade." He placed a water container just beyond her reach, close enough that she could see it, but far enough away that her bound position made access impossible. The psychological torture of dying of thirst while water remained visible would add another dimension to her suffering. "Maybe if you're really lucky, someone will come looking for you before the buzzards do," Hayes added with satisfaction. Of course, they'll have to choose between following me to water or wasting time on a troublemaker who brought this on herself. The guide returned to camp, leaving Sarah alone with the pain of countless cactus spines and the growing terror of her situation. She could feel the barbs working deeper into her arms with each breath, each slight movement sending waves of agony through her body. The cloth in her mouth prevented her from calling for help, and the rope bindings were expertly tied to prevent escape. As the eastern horizon began to show the first faint traces of dawn, Sarah realized the full horror of her predicament. The desert sun would soon transform her position into a furnace, with the dark surface of the cacti absorbing and radiating heat that would make survival impossible. Hayes had essentially sentenced her to one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable, and he had done so in a way that would terrorize the other travelers into absolute submission. The pre-dawn hours brought sounds from the distant camp that filled Sarah with desperate hope and crushing despair. She could hear voices calling her name, the sounds of people searching through their limited area, but Hayes's voice dominated the conversations, explaining that Sarah had wandered off during the night, probably disoriented by the stress of desert. "Travel happens sometimes," she heard him tell the searchers. "The desert does things to people's minds, makes them do foolish things. We can't waste water and time searching for someone who chose to walk away from safety." Rebecca's voice, weak but determined, challenged Hayes's explanation. Despite her head injury, Sarah's cousin insisted that something was wrong, that Sarah would never have left the camp voluntarily. But Hayes had anticipated this objection, producing evidence he claimed to have found of Sarah's deliberate departure. "Found these leading away from camp," he announced, showing what were supposedly Sarah's footprints in the sand. "Clear trail, heading south, like she was trying to walk back to the main trail on her own. The foolish woman probably thought she knew better than her guide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The fabricated evidence was convincing enough to silence most objections, especially coming from the man they still depended on for survival. The travelers were faced with an impossible choice: waste precious time and resources searching for someone who might already be dead, or trust their guide's assessment and continue toward the water sources he promised lay ahead. Fear proved stronger than loyalty. One by one, the families decided that their own survival had to take priority over searching for Sarah. The desert was vast, their water was limited, and Hayes insisted that any delay could prove fatal for the entire wagon train. As the sun rose higher and the camp prepared to move on, Sarah listened to the sounds of her abandonment with growing despair. The voices calling her name grew fainter and finally stopped altogether. The creak of wagon wheels and the sound of departing horses marked the moment when she truly understood that she was alone in the desert, bound to instruments of torture, facing a death that Hayes had designed to be as prolonged and agonizing as possible. The morning heat began to build quickly, transforming the air around the cacti into shimmering waves that distorted her vision. The spines that held her seemed to grow hotter with each passing minute, adding the torture of burning metal to the agony of punctured flesh. Her mouth, already dry from fear and the restrictive gag, began to feel like leather as the desert began its attempt to claim another victim. But Sarah Elizabeth Patterson had not survived 26 years of her father's financial schemes and social pressures by surrendering easily to circumstances beyond her control. Even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her consciousness, even as the heat began its merciless assault on her body, she began to analyze her situation with the same methodical intelligence that had once helped her navigate Boston's complex social hierarchies. The ropes that bound her were tight, but not impossible. The cactus spines were agonizing, but not immediately fatal. The sun was rising, but had not yet reached its killing intensity. If she could find a way to endure the pain, if she could discover some method of loosening her bonds, if she could survive until the desert's mysterious rhythms brought relief or rescue, she might yet live to see Coleman Hayes face justice for his cruelty. As the abandoned wagon train disappeared into the heat haze, leaving only dust clouds and wheel ruts to mark their passage, Sarah began the most important fight of her life. She was alone, tortured, and facing death in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, but she was also alive, conscious, and possessed of a will that had been hardened by years of surviving in circumstances that demanded constant adaptation. The desert had claimed Coleman Hayes' soul, transforming him from guide to torturer. Now it would test whether Sarah Patterson possessed the strength to resist its cruel embrace, or whether she too would become another victim of the wasteland's ancient hunger for human suffering. The sun climbed relentlessly toward its noon throne, transforming the Mojave into a furnace that seemed designed to test the very limits of human endurance. Sarah's world had narrowed to the immediate reality of pain, thirst, and the growing certainty that Coleman Hayes had crafted her death with calculated precision. The cactus spines, which had felt like burning needles at dawn, now seemed to pulse with their own malevolent heat as the desert temperature soared past anything she had ever experienced. But within the crucible of her suffering, something unexpected began to emerge. As the hours passed and her situation grew more desperate, Sarah discovered reserves of strength and clarity that her sheltered Boston upbringing had never demanded. The same analytical mind that had helped her navigate complex social situations now turned its full attention to the mechanics of survival. The ropes that bound her were hemp, dried and brittle from months of desert exposure. Hayes had tied them with the confidence of a man who believed his victim would be dead long before. Escape became possible, but he had underestimated both the quality of Sarah's education and her capacity for methodical problem-solving. Her governess, Miss Catherine Wright, had been an unconventional woman who believed that young ladies should understand more than embroidery and French conversation. Among Miss Wright's more practical lessons had been basic principles of physics and engineering, knowledge considered inappropriate for well-bred women, but which now proved invaluable. Sarah began to work the ropes against the cactus spines systematically, using the plant's own weapons against her bonds. Each movement brought fresh agony, but each fiber that parted brought her closer to freedom. The process required a kind of meditation on pain that transformed her relationship with suffering itself. Instead of fighting against the spines that pierced her flesh, she began to work with them, using their sharp edges as cutting tools while minimizing the damage they inflicted. The technique demanded absolute concentration, forcing her to enter a mental state where pain became information rather than torment. As she worked, Sarah's awareness of her surroundings expanded beyond the immediate circle of her captivity. The desert, which had seemed like an empty wasteland from the safety of the wagon train, revealed itself as a complex ecosystem filled with subtle signs of life and possibility. Birds she couldn't identify called from hidden perches, their songs suggesting the presence of water sources that weren't visible from ground level. The cacti themselves, which Hayes had chosen as instruments of torture, began to reveal properties that could serve survival rather than death. Sarah remembered stories she had heard from California settlers about desert plants that stored water, indigenous knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for someone stranded in this harsh environment. The barrel cacti that held her prisoner were themselves reservoirs containing gallons of moisture that could sustain life if properly accessed. But knowledge without tools remained merely a theoretical possibility. Sarah needed to free herself before she could act on any of the survival strategies that were beginning to form in her mind. The sun's angle told her that several hours had passed since the wagon train's departure, and her body's increasing weakness warned that time was becoming her most critical resource. The breakthrough came when she discovered that one of the cactus spines holding her bonds had been loosened by her systematic working against the rope. By angling her body carefully, she could put pressure on this particular spine in a way that gradually worked it free from the plant's flesh. The process was excruciating, requiring her to push deeper into the cactus to gain the leverage needed. But it offered the first real hope of escape she had experienced. Working with infinite patience and growing skill, Sarah managed to extract the spine without breaking it. The needle was nearly 4 inches long and sharp as any metal tool, providing her with the implement she needed to cut through the remaining rope fibers. The work was delicate and dangerous, requiring her to saw through her bonds without severing the arteries in her wrists, but it offered a path to freedom that hadn't existed moments before. As the rope finally parted and her hands came free, Sarah experienced a moment of triumph that was immediately followed by new challenges. Her arms, punctured by dozens of cactus spines and weakened by hours of constrained circulation, barely functioned. The simple act of removing the gag from her mouth required several attempts, and when she finally managed to call out, her voice was barely a whisper in the vast desert silence. Freedom of movement brought with it the full scope of her predicament. She was alone in unmapped territory with no water, no food, no shelter, and no clear direction toward safety. The wagon train had disappeared hours ago, leaving only wheel ruts in the sand that were already being obscured by the desert wind. Even if she could determine which direction they had traveled, pursuing them on foot across the desert would likely prove fatal. But Sarah had not endured hours of torture and fought her way to freedom only to surrender to despair. The same determination that had sustained her through the rope-cutting process now focused on the immediate requirements of survival. Water was the most critical need, followed by shelter from the murderous sun, then some means of signaling her, a presence to potential rescuers. The barrel cacti that had served as her prison now became her first source of hope. Using the extracted spine as a tool, Sarah began the careful process of accessing the moisture stored within the plant's flesh. The technique required precision to avoid contaminating the water with the toxic compounds that protected the cactus from herbivores, but her governess's botany lessons provided the basic knowledge needed to extract drinkable liquid. The water she obtained was bitter and slightly viscous, nothing like the clear spring water she had known in Boston, but it was sufficient to begin rehydrating her body and clearing the fog of delirium that had been building throughout the morning. Each swallow brought renewed strength and sharper mental focus, allowing her to plan beyond the immediate moment of survival. Shelter was the next priority. The desert sun was approaching its most dangerous intensity, and exposure to its full force would quickly undo any benefits gained from accessing water. Sarah surveyed her surroundings with new eyes, looking for natural formations that could provide protection during the deadly afternoon hours. A cluster of large boulders, perhaps 50 yards away, offered the possibility of shade, but reaching them would require crossing open ground during the peak heat period. The decision to move immediately rather than wait for cooler temperatures was based on her growing understanding of desert dynamics. The shade she needed would only exist during specific sun angles, and delaying her movement might mean losing the opportunity altogether. Gathering her remaining strength and wrapping cloth from her torn dress around her head for minimal protection, Sarah began the journey toward potential shelter. The 50-yard walk became an odyssey that tested every lesson she had learned about endurance and determination. The sand beneath her feet radiated heat that penetrated through her boots, while the air itself seemed to burn her lungs with each breath. Twice she stumbled and nearly fell, saved only by her desperate focus on the boulder cluster that represented survival. When she finally reached the rocks and collapsed into their blessed shade, Sarah experienced a profound moment of transformation. She was no longer the sheltered Boston socialite who had boarded the wagon train weeks earlier. The desert had stripped away the artificial constraints of her previous life, revealing capabilities and inner strength that society had never encouraged her to develop. The afternoon hours in the boulder shelter provided time for Sarah to take inventory of her resources and develop a more comprehensive survival strategy. Her dress, while torn and stained, could be fashioned into additional protection against sun and wind. The cactus spine that had freed her could serve as a tool for various tasks. Most importantly, her growing knowledge of desert survival techniques could be systematically expanded through careful observation and experimentation. As she rested in the shade, Sarah began to notice details of her environment that had been invisible during her earlier crisis. Animal tracks in the sand suggested regular movement patterns that might lead to water sources. The flight paths of birds provided clues about the location of hidden springs or seasonal streams. Even the growth patterns of desert vegetation offered information about underground water tables and prevailing wind directions. But perhaps most significantly, Sarah began to understand that her survival depended not just on individual resourcefulness, but on her ability to read and work with the desert's natural rhythms. The harsh landscape that had seemed like an enemy was actually a complex system that could support life if approached with proper knowledge and respect. As the sun began its afternoon descent, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Instead of simply waiting for rescue or attempting to retrace the wagon train's route, she would move deeper into the desert, following the signs and signals that pointed toward more reliable water sources and better shelter. The choice required abandoning any hope of quick salvation in favor of a longer-term survival strategy based on adaptation and learning. The preparation for her journey revealed how completely her perspective had changed. Instead of lamenting the loss of her civilized comforts, Sarah focused on identifying natural resources that could serve her needs. Desert grasses could be woven into primitive sandals to protect her feet. Certain cacti produced fruits that might provide both nutrition and additional moisture. Rock formations could serve as landmarks for navigation and sources of shade during rest periods. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that her educated mind, far from being useless in the wilderness, was actually her greatest asset. The same analytical abilities that had helped her master complex social situations could be applied to understanding desert ecology, weather patterns, and survival techniques. Her capacity for systematic observation and logical reasoning gave her advantages that physical strength alone could never provide. As evening approached and the desert began its transformation from furnace to cooling wilderness, Sarah set out on her chosen path with a confidence that would have amazed anyone who had known her in Boston. She was still in desperate danger, still facing challenges that could easily prove fatal, but she was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The desert had intended to claim her life through Coleman Hayes's cruelty, but instead, it had awakened capabilities that her sheltered existence had never required. Each step away from the site of her torture was a step toward a new understanding of her own potential, a recognition that survival often depended less on favorable circumstances than on the willingness to adapt and grow in response to challenges. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, transforming the harsh landscape into something approaching beauty. Sarah walked steadily toward the distant mountains, following animal trails and natural landmarks, carrying within her the growing certainty that she possessed the intelligence and determination needed to survive in this ancient land. Behind her, the barrel cacti that had served as both prison and salvation stood silent in the gathering dusk, their spines glinting in the fading light like stars fallen to earth. They had witnessed the transformation of a Boston socialite into a desert survivor, a metamorphosis that proved the desert's power to reveal hidden strength in those brave enough to face its challenges. The night ahead would bring new dangers and fresh tests of her evolving skills, but Sarah Patterson walked toward it with the steady gait of someone who had discovered that survival was not about avoiding hardship, but about developing the wisdom and courage needed to transform obstacles into opportunities. The desert had tried to break her, but instead it had forged her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The desert night descended with a swiftness that caught Sarah unprepared for its dramatic transformation. Within minutes of sunset, the furnace heat that had dominated the day gave way to a bone-deep cold that penetrated her torn clothing and sent shivers through her exhausted body. The temperature swing was so severe that she began to understand why experienced desert travelers spoke of this land as a place of extremes that could kill through either fire or ice. Sarah had been walking for nearly 3 hours, following what appeared to be an ancient animal trail that wound between towering rock formations and stands of Joshua trees. Her improvised navigation system, based on star positions and natural landmarks, had kept her moving generally northward toward distant mountains that promised higher elevation and possible water sources. But the onset of night brought challenges she hadn't anticipated. The familiar constellations that had guided her father's merchant ships looked different in the crystal-clear desert air, brighter and more numerous than anything she had seen through Boston's industrial haze. More disorienting was the way the landscape itself seemed to shift and change in the moonlight, transforming familiar rock formations into alien shapes that challenged her sense of direction and distance. It was while she paused to get her bearings near a distinctive outcropping of red sandstone that Sarah first became aware she was no longer alone in the wilderness. The sensation began as nothing more than a prickling at the back of her neck, an intuitive awareness that she was being observed. Years of navigating Boston's social complexities had taught her to recognize the weight of watching eyes, but this felt different, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous. Sarah forced herself to continue walking at a steady pace while using her peripheral vision to scan the shadows around her. Twice she caught glimpses of movement that seemed too deliberate to be attributed to wind or small desert animals. Once she was certain she heard the soft scrape of moccasin leather against stone, a sound so faint it might have been imagination, but which sent adrenaline surging through her system. The stalking continued for nearly an hour, during which Sarah's initial fear gradually transformed into something approaching analytical curiosity. Whoever was following her possessed skills that bordered on the supernatural, able to move through the desert night with barely detectable presence. More intriguingly, they seemed content to observe rather than attack, maintaining a careful distance that suggested caution rather than predatory intent. Sarah's decision to confront her shadow came when she reached a natural clearing surrounded by tall Joshua trees. The open space would make concealment difficult for any observer while providing her with multiple escape routes if the encounter turned hostile. More importantly, the moonlight would allow her to see clearly for the first time since becoming aware of the presence. "I know you're out there," she called into the darkness, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've known for the past hour. If you mean to harm me, you've had plenty of opportunities. If you don't, then perhaps we can speak like civilized people." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah began to wonder if her exhaustion and stress had created phantom stalkers from her own imagination. Then, with a fluidity that seemed to violate the laws of physics, a figure emerged from shadows that had appeared empty moments before. The man who stood at the edge of the clearing was unlike anyone Sarah had ever encountered. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with the lean, powerful build of someone whose life demanded constant physical challenge. His long black hair was bound with leather strips, and his clothing, a mixture of traditional buckskin and more modern cotton, spoke of someone who moved easily between different worlds. But it was his face that captured Sarah's attention most. Completely. His features held an intelligence and intensity that reminded her of the most brilliant professors at Harvard, combined with an alertness that suggested intimate familiarity with danger. His dark eyes studied her with an evaluation so thorough she felt as though he was reading the story of her recent ordeal in the details of her appearance. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the moonlit clearing without speaking. Sarah was acutely aware of how she must appear, a white woman alone in the desert, her clothing torn and stained, her face marked by exhaustion and recent trauma. She wondered what conclusions her observer was drawing about her presence in this remote location. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the musical cadences of his native language overlaid with English that was more precise and educated than she had expected. "You are far from any settlement, and you travel without horse, water, or proper equipment. Either you are very lost or very foolish." "Perhaps both," Sarah replied, deciding that honesty was more likely to serve her than attempted deception. "I was abandoned here by our wagon train guide, a man named Coleman Hayes, who decided I had become inconvenient to his plans." The Apache man's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Hayes's name, and Sarah caught a flicker of what might have been recognition or anger. "This Hayes, he is known to my people as a man who brings trouble wherever he travels. Tell me how you came to be alone." Sarah found herself recounting the events of the past day in more detail than she had intended. Something about the man's focused attention and obvious intelligence encouraged her to include elements of the story that revealed her own analytical approach to survival. She described her methodical escape from the cacti, her discovery of water, extraction techniques, and her strategic decision to move deeper into the desert rather than attempt to follow the wagon train. As she spoke, she noticed that her listener's posture and expression were changing. The initial wariness was being replaced by what appeared to be professional interest, as though he was evaluating her responses for competence rather than merely gathering information. When she finished her account, he nodded with what seemed like approval. "My name is Joseph Runningwolf," he said, using the English version of what was obviously a more complex native designation. "I am a scout for my people, and I have been tracking the movements of Hayes and his wagon train for several days. Your presence here creates complications." What kind of complications? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would not be reassuring. Hayes has been spreading lies in the settlements, claiming that Apache war parties are threatening peaceful travelers. He uses fear to justify taking routes through our territory without permission, routes that lead past sacred sites and seasonal camps. My people have asked me to determine whether his claims have any truth to them. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together. Hayes's increasingly erratic behavior, his insistence on unmapped shortcuts, his paranoid responses to questions about their route, all of it suggested a man whose desperation extended beyond simple gambling debts. "What did you discover?" she asked. Joseph's expression darkened. Hayes travels with outlaws who pretend to be legitimate settlers. They scout our territory, marking locations of water sources and defensible positions. This wagon train is not seeking new homes in California. It is gathering intelligence for men who plan to claim Apache lands through force. The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. She had assumed Hayes's betrayal was personal, driven by anger at her challenges to his authority. Instead, she had apparently stumbled into the middle of a much larger conspiracy that could affect the lives of hundreds of people, the families. "On the wagon train," she said urgently. "The Kowalskis, the Thorntons, Marcus Webb, they're innocent people who trusted Hayes to guide them safely to new lives. They don't know anything about land schemes or intelligence gathering." "This, I believe," Joseph replied, "but Hayes has placed them in great danger. Some of my people's war leaders believe the entire wagon train is part of the conspiracy. They speak of attacking before the scouts can return with their information." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, like a physical burden. Her escape from Hayes's torture had been only the beginning of a crisis that could explode into violence and tragedy. The innocent families who had abandoned her to save themselves were now facing threats they couldn't even comprehend. "Is there a way to warn them?" she asked, "to separate the innocent travelers from Hayes and his conspirators before anyone gets hurt?" Joseph studied her for a long moment before responding. "There might be, but it would require trust between peoples who have learned to fear each other. Your presence here could be either an opportunity or another complication, depending on choices that have not yet been made." "What kind of choices?" "Hayes will discover you are missing when his party makes camp tonight. He will either claim you died trying to find water, or he will organize a search party to find and eliminate you before you can expose his crimes. Either way, he knows you represent a threat to his plans." Sarah nodded, understanding the tactical situation with the same clarity she had once applied to Boston's complex social dynamics. "So, I can't simply hide until this resolves itself. Hayes will keep hunting for me until he's certain I'm dead." "This is true. But there is another possibility. You could come with me to speak with my people's leaders. Your testimony about Hayes' true nature might convince them that the wagon train contains both enemies and innocents who deserve different treatment." The proposal was simultaneously terrifying and compelling. Sarah understood that accepting Joseph's invitation would mean crossing boundaries that few white people had ever traversed voluntarily. She would be placing her life in the hands of people her culture had taught her to fear, trusting their justice system and their willingness to distinguish between guilty and innocent. But the alternative, remaining alone in the desert while Hayes organized search parties to hunt her down, offered even less hope for survival. More importantly, her testimony might be the only thing that could prevent a massacre of the innocent families who were trapped by Hayes's larger conspiracy. "How do I know your people will listen to a white woman's testimony?" Sarah asked. "How do I know they won't simply see me as another enemy to be eliminated?" Joseph's expression shifted in a way that suggested the question touched on deeper issues than simple tactical considerations. Among my people, truth is valued more highly than the race of the person who speaks it. But you are correct that trust must be earned rather than assumed. You would need to prove your sincerity through actions as well as words. What kind of actions? You claim to understand desert survival and to possess knowledge that helped you escape death. My people respect competence and wisdom wherever they find it. If you can demonstrate that your mind and skills have value, that you offer something beyond mere testimony about Hayes, then your words will carry weight. Sarah considered the proposal while watching Joseph's face for clues about his own assessment of her capabilities. She had impressed him with her account of systematic problem-solving and strategic thinking, but that was only the beginning of what would be required to earn genuine respect from his community. "There's something else," Joseph continued. "My people have traditions about medicine and healing that go beyond treating physical injuries. We believe that some individuals possess gifts for helping others overcome spiritual wounds, trauma, fear, despair. Your survival of Hayes's torture and your transformation from victim to active problem solver suggest you might possess such gifts." The concept was foreign to anything Sarah had learned in Boston, where healing was viewed as purely a matter of medical science and religious consolation. But something in Joseph's description resonated with her growing understanding of her own capabilities. "Are you saying your people might accept me as some kind of medicine person?" she asked. "I am saying that survival often depends on recognizing gifts wherever they appear, regardless of their source. If you can help my people, while they help you, if you can contribute wisdom while gaining protection, then you become valuable rather than merely tolerated." As dawn began to paint the eastern horizon with subtle shades of rose and gold, Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. She would trust Joseph Running Wolf and allow him to guide her toward an uncertain future. Among his people, the choice represented not just a survival strategy, but a fundamental transformation in her understanding of her own identity and capabilities. "I'll come with you," she said simply. "I'll trust your people's justice and try to prove my worth through whatever contributions I can make." Joseph nodded with what appeared to be satisfaction and perhaps relief. "Then we must move quickly. Hayes will organize his search at first light, and we need to be well away from this area before his men begin tracking your movement." As they prepared to leave the clearing, Sarah realized that she was crossing a threshold that would change everything about her life. The sheltered Boston socialite who had boarded the wagon train was disappearing forever, being replaced by someone whose identity was still forming, but who possessed capabilities she was only beginning to understand. The alliance with Joseph Running Wolf represented more than simple survival cooperation. It was the beginning of a partnership that would challenge every assumption both cultures had made about the other, proving that understanding and mutual respect could flourish even in the harsh crucible of the desert's ancient wisdom. The journey toward Joseph's people began before dawn, following trails that existed more in memory than physical reality. Sarah quickly discovered that traveling with an Apache scout meant abandoning every assumption she had developed about desert navigation during her solo escape. Where she had followed obvious animal paths and relied on celestial markers, Joseph moved through the landscape with an intuitive understanding that seemed to read invisible signs in the placement of stones, the growth patterns of vegetation, and the subtle variations in soil composition. Their route took them through terrain that challenged Sarah's growing confidence in her desert survival abilities. Instead of the relatively open country she had traversed alone, Joseph led her through a maze of slot canyons, hidden valleys, and natural passages that required intimate knowledge to navigate safely. The landscape seemed designed to conceal secrets, with each twist and turn revealing new vistas that had been completely invisible moments before. "Your people know this country well," Sarah observed as they paused at a natural overlook that provided sweeping views of the surrounding territory. "This knowledge comes from generations who understood that survival depends on becoming part of the land rather than trying to conquer it," Joseph replied. "Each canyon, each water source, each safe passage has been mapped not on paper, but in the memories of those who learned its lessons through experience." As they traveled, Joseph began sharing knowledge that transformed Sarah's understanding of the desert ecosystem. Plants that had appeared identical to her untrained eye revealed themselves as distinct species with different properties and uses. Rock formations that seemed random showed evidence of ancient geological processes that created predictable patterns of shelter, water collection, and mineral deposits. More importantly, Joseph's instruction revealed the extent to which Apache survival depended on sophisticated understanding of natural cycles and relationships. The timing of their journey was coordinated with seasonal water flows, animal migration patterns, and weather systems that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. What appeared to outsiders as wilderness was actually a complex, well-understood environment that supported thriving communities when approached with proper knowledge. But the educational aspect of their journey was overshadowed by growing evidence that Hayes's conspiracy was more extensive and immediate than either of them had initially realized. Throughout the first day of travel, Joseph pointed out signs of recent passage by riders who were clearly not Apache. Bootprints, horse tracks, and abandoned campsites indicated that scouts had been systematically exploring the territory, mapping routes and resources with military precision. The discovery that most concerned Joseph came when they encountered a hidden spring that his people had used for generations. The site showed evidence of recent tampering. Someone had attempted to divert the water flow and had left markers that could only be surveying stakes. The implication was clear. Hayes's conspirators weren't just gathering intelligence about Apache movements and defensive positions. They were already beginning to claim and modify water sources that were essential to indigenous survival. "This goes beyond land speculation," Joseph said grimly as he examined the evidence. "Someone is preparing for systematic displacement of my people from territory we have occupied for centuries." Sarah studied the surveying markers with a growing alarm. Her father's business dealings had given her familiarity with land development, schemes, and the signs she was seeing suggested a level of organization and financing that went far beyond anything a few outlaws could manage independently. "These stakes are professionally placed," she observed. "Whoever is doing this has access to trained surveyors and significant capital investment. This isn't opportunistic claim jumping. It's an organized territorial acquisition." The realization added new urgency to their mission. If Hayes was working with well-funded conspirators who were already beginning to establish claims on Apache water sources, then the window for preventing conflict was rapidly closing. More immediately, it meant that their journey to Joseph's people was taking them through territory that was already under surveillance by hostile forces. Their second day of travel brought them into contact with these forces directly. Joseph's exceptional scouting skills detected the presence of mounted observers long before they became visible, allowing them to take concealment in a natural cave system that provided both shelter and strategic vantage points. From their hidden position, they were able to observe a party of 6 riders conducting what was obviously systematic reconnaissance of the surrounding area. The riders were not the desperate outlaws Sarah had expected. Instead, they appeared to be experienced professionals, well-equipped and operating with military discipline. Their leader, a man with the bearing of a former cavalry officer, directed the survey work with competence that suggested extensive planning and preparation. "Do you recognize any of them?" Joseph asked quietly as they watched the survey party's methodical work. Sarah studied the distant figures through Joseph's small telescope, focusing particularly on their leader. Something about the man's posture and the way he gestured to his subordinates seemed familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have encountered him. "The leader reminds me of someone," she said slowly, "but I can't be certain. There was a man at my father's shipping office who had similar bearing, a former military officer who had invested in California land speculation. His name was Morrison, Colonel James Morrison." Joseph's expression sharpened with interest. "Morrison is the name of the merchant you are traveling to marry in Los Angeles?" "Jonathan Morrison, yes. But I was told he was a simple trader, not someone connected to territorial development schemes." Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form a disturbing picture. "If this Colonel Morrison is related to my intended husband, then my engagement might have been part of the conspiracy from the beginning." The implications were staggering. Her father's arrangement of her marriage, which she had assumed was simply a financial necessity driven by business debts, might actually have been part of a coordinated plan to place her in a position where she could provide intelligence about territorial conditions and Apache movements. Her journey west hadn't been an unfortunate accident that had exposed her to Hayes's betrayal. It had been a carefully orchestrated infiltration that had gone wrong when she had proven more observant and independent than anticipated. "If this is true," Joseph said grimly, "then your escape from Hayes was more significant than either of us realized. You weren't just a troublemaker who interfered with a guide's authority. You were a failed intelligence asset who had learned too much about their operations." The survey party's activities confirmed their worst suspicions. Using sophisticated equipment, the men were mapping not just water sources and terrain features, but also travel routes, defensive positions, and seasonal camping areas that could only have been identified through extensive reconnaissance. Someone had been studying Apache territorial patterns for months, gathering information that could be used to predict and counter indigenous resistance to land seizure. As they continued to observe, Sarah noticed details that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy's preparation. The survey party's equipment included military-grade instruments that were far beyond what civilian land speculators would normally possess. More ominously, their mapping techniques followed patterns that Sarah recognized from her father's work with government maritime surveys. These men had access to official territorial development plans. "Joseph," she said urgently, "I think this conspiracy involves people with connections to territorial government offices. The techniques they're using, the quality of their equipment, the systematic nature of their survey, this suggests they have access to official resources and possibly advanced knowledge of territorial policy decisions." The realization that their opponents might include corrupt government officials transformed the nature of the crisis they were facing. Simple land grabbing by opportunistic criminals was one thing, but organized theft backed by territorial authority was an entirely different level of threat. It meant that legal remedies might be ineffective and that Apache resistance could be portrayed as rebellion against legitimate government authority. Their observation of the survey party also revealed immediate tactical challenges. The professional competence of Hayes's associates meant that pursuit would be methodical and well-organized. These weren't men who would be easily evaded or discouraged by difficult terrain. Moreover, their obvious familiarity with the territory suggested they had been operating in the area for an extended period. When the survey party finally moved on, continuing their systematic mapping of water sources and strategic positions, Joseph led Sarah deeper into the canyon system toward what he described as a gathering place, where several Apache bands were coming together to discuss the growing threat to their territory. The urgency of their mission had increased dramatically with the discovery that their opponents were already well advanced in their preparations. The final day of their journey took them through a landscape that revealed why Apache resistance had been so effective against previous intrusions. The country became increasingly vertical and complex, with natural fortifications that could be defended by small numbers against much larger forces. Hidden passages connected defensive positions in ways that would allow rapid movement and communication between seemingly isolated strongholds, but the natural advantages of the terrain were being systematically neutralized by the intelligence gathering Sarah and Joseph had observed. The survey party's mapping would allow attackers to identify weak points, alternative routes, and resource dependencies that could be exploited to overcome Apache defensive advantages. "Your people need to know about the surveying," Sarah said. "As they navigated a particularly challenging passage, if they understand how thoroughly their positions have been studied, they can adapt their defensive strategies accordingly." "This is one reason why your testimony will be valuable," Joseph replied. "You understand the methods being used against us in ways that my people might not immediately recognize. Your knowledge could help us counter their advantages." As they approached the gathering place, Sarah could see smoke rising from multiple fires, indicating a significant concentration of people in the hidden valley ahead. The sight brought a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She was about to meet with Apache leaders under circumstances that could determine the fate of both the innocent wagon train families and the broader territorial conflict. But more. Immediately, Sarah realized that she was about to discover whether her transformation from sheltered socialite to desert survivor would prove sufficient to earn acceptance from people whose survival depended on accurate assessment of character and capability. The journey with Joseph had been an extended test of her adaptability and resourcefulness. Now she would face the ultimate evaluation of whether her newfound skills and insights could contribute to solutions for problems that threatened entire communities. The hidden valley that opened before them contained one of the most remarkable sights Sarah had ever witnessed. Dozens of traditional dwellings were arranged with obvious strategic planning around natural water sources and defensive positions. But what struck her most forcefully was the sense of order and purposeful activity that characterized the community. This wasn't a primitive encampment struggling for survival, but a sophisticated society that had adapted successfully to one of the world's most challenging environments. As they descended toward the valley floor, Sarah caught sight of individuals whose bearing and dress marked them as leaders of significant status. These were the people who would decide whether her alliance with Joseph represented an opportunity for mutual benefit or simply another threat to be eliminated. Her survival now depended not just on physical endurance or tactical intelligence, but on her ability to bridge cultural gaps that had been widened by generations of conflict and misunderstanding. The stakes had escalated far beyond her personal escape from Hayes's torture. The knowledge she carried about the conspiracy's scope and methods, combined with her understanding of territorial politics and land development techniques, might represent the difference between successful Apache resistance and the loss of ancestral territories that had sustained their people for centuries. But first, she would have to prove herself worthy of their trust in a culture that measured worth through criteria completely different from anything her Boston upbringing had prepared her to understand. The journey toward survival had become a journey toward transformation that would test not just her capabilities, but her fundamental assumptions about identity, loyalty, and the meaning of belonging to a community. The Apache Council fire burned at the heart of a natural amphitheater carved by centuries of wind and water into the red sandstone walls of the hidden valley. Sarah found herself seated in a circle of faces that represented not just tribal leadership, but generations of accumulated wisdom about survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The firelight revealed weathered features that spoke of lives spent reading subtle signs in landscape, weather, and human behavior, skills that would now be focused on evaluating her credibility and potential value to their community. The formal introductions followed protocols that Sarah was only beginning to understand, but which clearly served multiple purposes beyond simple courtesy. Each leader's presentation included not just their name and band affiliation, but also their specific areas of expertise and their role in the complex decision-making processes that governed Apache responses to external threats. What emerged from these introductions was a picture of sophisticated political organization that bore little resemblance to the primitive tribal structures described in government reports. Chief among the assembled leaders was a woman whose presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the circle. White Dove, as Joseph translated her Apache name, served as both war leader and keeper of traditional knowledge for her band. Her intelligent eyes studied Sarah with an evaluation so thorough it felt like being examined by a skilled physician, who could diagnose not just physical ailments, but spiritual and psychological conditions as well. Joseph Running Wolf has told us of your survival against Coleman Hayes and your observations of the survey teams, White Dove said in carefully modulated English that revealed extensive contact with white settlements. But survival alone does not qualify someone to speak in our councils. Tell us why your words should carry weight in decisions that will affect the lives of our children and grandchildren. The question struck at the heart of Sarah's transformation, from protected socialite to someone claiming the right to influence matters of life and death. She had survived Hayes's torture and learned basic desert navigation, but these accomplishments meant little compared to the lifelong expertise of the people evaluating her. Her value, if any existed, would have to be found in knowledge and perspectives that complemented rather than duplicated Apache capabilities. I cannot claim wisdom about your land or your ways, Sarah began, choosing her words with the same care she had once applied to Boston's complex social negotiations. But I understand the methods and motivations of the people who threaten your territory. I know how land speculation works, how government surveying leads to legal claims, and how territorial politics can be manipulated to provide official justification for theft. She withdrew from her clothing the surveyor's marker she had recovered during their observation of the reconnaissance party, placing it in the center of the circle where all could examine it. This stake represents more than boundary marking. It's evidence of a legal process that will be used to claim your water sources under territorial law. Once these claims are filed, resistance to them can be prosecuted as interference with legitimate property rights. The marker passed from hand to hand around the circle, examined by leaders whose understanding of its implications became increasingly grave. Several spoke rapidly in Apache, their tone suggesting urgent debate about responses to this new form of threat. White Dove listened carefully to the discussions before addressing Sarah again. You speak of legal processes and territorial law as if they have authority over lands our people have occupied for centuries. Why should we concern ourselves with papers and claims made by governments we never accepted? Sarah recognized the fundamental challenge embedded in the question. Apache leaders had valid reasons for dismissing the authority of territorial governments that had been imposed without their consent, but practical resistance required understanding the methods that would be used against them, regardless of their legitimacy. Because those legal processes will be used to justify military action against you, she replied. Once land claims are officially filed, any resistance can be labeled as lawless violence, requiring federal intervention. The people behind this conspiracy are not just stealing your territory. They're creating legal frameworks that will make you appear to be the criminals when you defend it. The observations sparked intense discussion among the council members. Joseph translated the rapid exchanges, revealing deep divisions about how to respond to threats that operated through unfamiliar legal and political mechanisms. Some leaders favored immediate military action to drive out the surveyors before their work could be completed. Others argued for diplomatic approaches that might prevent escalation to open warfare. It was during this debate that a scout arrived with intelligence that transformed the entire nature of the crisis. The messenger, a young man named Swift Eagle, brought news that struck the council like lightning. Hayes's wagon train had been intercepted by a U.S. Army patrol led by Captain Benjamin Richards, an officer known for his aggressive enforcement of territorial policy. The soldiers have taken the wagon train into protective custody, Swift Eagle reported. Captain Richards claims he is investigating reports of Apache aggression against peaceful settlers. Hayes has convinced him that the missing woman, he nodded towards Sarah, was killed in an unprovoked attack. The revelation hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Hayes had not only abandoned her to die, but was now using her presumed death as justification for military action against the very people who had saved her life. Her survival, which should have exposed his lies, was instead creating complications that could trigger exactly the kind of conflict that everyone was trying to prevent. White Dove's expression hardened as she absorbed the implications of the news. This Hayes is more cunning than we realized. He creates the violence he claims to be defending against, then uses official authority to punish his victims. But Swift Eagle's report contained information that made the situation even more complex. Captain Richards had not simply taken the wagon train into custody, he had ordered them to continue toward Los Angeles under military escort, with Hayes remaining as their guide. The decision suggested either remarkable naivety about Hayes's true nature or possible collusion with the conspiracy Sarah had uncovered. There's more, Swift Eagle continued. The military escort includes additional personnel who are not regular Army personnel. They wear uniforms, but their equipment and tactics suggest they are mercenaries or militia rather than federal soldiers. Joseph's expression grew grim as he translated this information for Sarah. Captain Richards may be part of the conspiracy himself, or he may be being manipulated by people who understand how to use military authority for private purposes. The possibility that corrupt military officers were involved in the land seizure scheme elevated the crisis to territorial proportions. If federal authority was being used to provide official cover for illegal appropriation of Apache lands, then traditional diplomatic solutions would be ineffective. Worse, any Apache resistance could be portrayed as rebellion against legitimate government authority, providing justification for massive military retaliation. White Dove rose from her position by the fire, her movement commanding immediate attention from all present. This changes everything we thought we understood about the threat we face. If territorial military forces are working with those who would steal our lands, then we cannot distinguish between legal authority and criminal conspiracy. She turned to address Sarah directly, her gaze carrying the weight of decisions that could affect hundreds of lives. You have brought us valuable intelligence about our enemy's methods, but now you must choose whether you will truly stand with us or remain caught between two worlds that are moving toward war. The challenge was more profound than Sarah had anticipated. White Dove wasn't simply asking for continued cooperation or information sharing. She was demanding a commitment that would require Sarah to abandon any possibility of returning to her previous life and accept full membership in a community that was preparing for potentially devastating conflict. What would such a choice mean? Sarah asked quietly. It would mean accepting training in our ways of medicine and healing, White Dove replied. Not just the treatment of wounds, but the restoration of spirits broken by trauma and loss. It would mean becoming someone who can help our people endure what may be coming, while helping them maintain their connection to traditions that define who we are. The concept was foreign to anything Sarah had learned about healing in Boston, where medicine was viewed as a purely physical science practiced by formally trained physicians. But her own experience of survival and transformation had taught her that recovery from trauma required more than treating physical injuries. "You're asking me to become a bridge between worlds," Sarah said, beginning to understand the full scope of what was being offered. "We are asking you to become someone who can help preserve what matters most about both worlds," White Dove corrected. "The innocent people in that wagon train will need healing from the betrayal they have experienced. Our people will need healing from the losses that war will bring. Someone who understands both cultures might be able to help both communities survive what is coming." The responsibility was staggering, but Sarah realized it also represented the ultimate expression of the transformation that had begun when she freed herself from Hayes's torture. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, and had learned that survival often depended on serving purposes larger than individual preservation. Before she could respond to White Dove's challenge, another complication emerged that would test everyone's commitment to peaceful solutions. A second messenger arrived with news that Captain Richards's military escort was not continuing toward Los Angeles as expected. Instead, they had established a fortified camp near the surveyed water sources and were demanding a meeting with Apache leaders to discuss territorial boundaries and peaceful coexistence. The military positioning suggested that Richards was either preparing for negotiation from a position of strength or setting up for military action against Apache communities. Either way, his presence near the disputed water sources meant that any Apache response would be interpreted through the lens of federal military authority. "They're forcing us to choose between abandoning our water sources or attacking federal soldiers," Joseph observed grimly. "Either choice plays into their larger strategy." White Dove nodded, her expression reflecting the weight of leadership in impossible circumstances. "We cannot attack soldiers who claim to be protecting innocent settlers, but we cannot allow them to control the water that our people need to survive." Sarah realized that her unique position might offer alternatives that weren't available to either side independently. As someone who understood both the legal mechanisms being used against the Apache and the cultural values that motivated their resistance, she might be able to propose solutions that served everyone's legitimate interests. "What if I could arrange to meet with Captain Richards?" she suggested. "As the supposedly dead woman whose murder Hayes is using to justify military intervention, my appearance might force him to reconsider his assumptions about what is actually happening here." The proposal sparked intense debate among the council members. Some saw it as an opportunity to expose Hayes's lies and potentially turn Captain Richards into an ally rather than an enemy. Others worried that Sarah's appearance would simply provide the military with a hostage who could be used to pressure Apache communities into submission. White Dove listened to the arguments before making a decision that reflected both tactical sophistication and profound trust. "You will go to Captain Richards, but not alone, and not as a supplicant seeking his protection. You will go as our medicine person, carrying our proposals for solutions that honor both Apache sovereignty and legitimate territorial authority." The decision transformed Sarah's role from refugee seeking protection to diplomatic representative carrying the authority to negotiate on behalf of Apache interests. It was a responsibility that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, but which now seemed like the natural culmination of her journey from victim to survivor to bridge builder between cultures. As the council meeting concluded and preparations began for what might be the most crucial diplomatic mission in Apache history, Sarah understood that she was about to discover whether the transformation that had begun with her escape from torture could extend to preventing the kind of systematic violence that had characterized territorial expansion throughout the West. The stakes had escalated beyond personal survival or even the immediate crisis. The choices made in the coming confrontation with Captain Richards could determine whether Apache communities would be able to maintain their connection to ancestral lands, or would be forced into the kind of desperate resistance that typically ended in tragic defeat. But Sarah also understood that she was no longer the same person who had been bound to cacti and left to die in the desert heat. She had become someone capable of carrying the hopes of two communities whose survival might depend on finding alternatives to the cycle of betrayal and violence that had brought them to this moment of crisis. The military encampment sprawled across the desert floor like a metallic spider, its perfectly ordered rows of tents and supply wagons standing in stark contrast to the organic curves of the landscape around it. Captain Benjamin Richards had chosen his position with tactical precision, establishing control over the disputed water source while maintaining clear fields of fire in all directions. The message was unmistakable. Federal authority had arrived, and resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Sarah approached the camp in the pre-dawn darkness, accompanied by Joseph and two Apache warriors whose presence served both as protection and as witnesses to whatever negotiations might unfold. Her transformation into an Apache medicine person was marked by clothing that White Dove had provided, traditional dress that identified her new role, while practical modifications that acknowledged her unique position as a bridge between cultures. The challenge of gaining access to Captain Richards without triggering immediate violence required careful choreography. Sarah carried a white flag made from her torn petticoat, a symbol that military protocol demanded be respected even from enemies. But more importantly, she carried documents that would force Richards to confront the contradictions in the story Hayes had constructed around her presumed death. The first checkpoint was manned by sentries whose nervous alertness revealed the strain of maintaining military discipline in territory they clearly viewed as hostile. The sight of a white woman in Apache dress approaching their lines created confusion that bought precious moments for explanation before anyone could reach for weapons. "I need to speak with Captain Richards immediately," Sarah announced to the sergeant commanding the checkpoint. "I am Sarah Patterson, the woman whose death Coleman Hayes has been using to justify military intervention in this territory." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. The sergeant's professional composure cracked as he struggled to process the implications of her statement. If Sarah was alive, then Hayes's claims about Apache aggression were exposed as lies. But her presence with Apache escorts raised questions about her loyalties that could be equally problematic for military planning. "Ma'am, you'll need to surrender any weapons and submit to escort while we verify your identity," the sergeant replied, falling back on standard protocols, while clearly uncertain about how to handle the unprecedented situation. Sarah nodded, understanding that military procedures would require validation of her claims before any substantive discussions could begin. But she also knew that every moment of delay increased the chances that Hayes would discover her survival and attempt to eliminate her before she could expose his deceptions. The escort through the military camp provided Sarah with crucial intelligence about the force she was attempting to influence. The soldiers she observed fell into two distinct categories: regular army personnel who showed typical frontier discipline, and auxiliary troops whose equipment and behavior suggested mercenary rather than military background. The division confirmed her suspicions that Captain Richards was operating with unofficial support that might compromise his independence. The captain's tent occupied the center of the encampment, positioned to provide maximum security while allowing easy access to all areas of the military operation. Richards himself proved to be a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but whose haggard appearance suggested he was operating under pressures that extended beyond normal military concerns. "Miss Patterson," Richards said, rising from behind a field desk covered with maps and reports, "Coleman Hayes reported that you were killed 3 days ago during an Apache attack on your wagon train. Your presence here raises questions that require immediate clarification." Sarah studied the captain's face carefully, looking for signs that would reveal whether he was a victim of Hayes's manipulation or a willing participant in the land seizure conspiracy. What she saw was genuine confusion mixed with the kind of political calculation that suggested someone trying to navigate complex pressures from multiple directions. "Captain Richards, I was not killed by Apache warriors," Sarah said clearly. "I was tortured and left to die by Coleman Hayes himself, who bound me to barrel cacti as punishment for questioning his authority and competence as a guide." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an artillery blast. Richards's expression shifted through surprise, skepticism, and growing concern as he absorbed the implications of her statement. If her claims were true, then his entire justification for military intervention was based on fabricated evidence provided by the very man he was supposed to be protecting. "These are serious allegations," Richards said carefully. "Do you have evidence to support your claims?" Sarah withdrew from her clothing the rope fragments she had preserved from her escape, their blood-stained condition providing graphic testimony to the torture she had endured. More importantly, she produced Hayes's own surveying notes, which she had discovered during her observation of the conspiracy's activities. "Hayes is not simply a failed wagon train guide," she continued. "He's part of an organized effort to steal Apache water sources through fraudulent land claims. These notes document systematic surveying of indigenous territory using military-grade equipment that suggests official support." Richards examined the evidence with growing alarm, his professional training allowing him to recognize the sophistication of the surveying work and its implications for territorial policy. The notes contained information that could only have been obtained through extensive reconnaissance, including details about Apache seasonal movements and defensive positions. "Where did you obtain these documents?" Richards asked, his tone shifting toward the kind of focused interrogation that suggested he was beginning to take her accusations seriously. "From surveying teams that have been operating in this territory for months," Sarah replied. "Teams that include former military personnel using government equipment to map Apache lands for illegal appropriation." The revelation struck at the heart of Richards's dilemma. If civilian land speculators had access to military resources and intelligence, it suggested corruption that extended high into territorial administration. More immediately, it meant that his mission to protect legitimate settlers might actually be providing cover for criminal conspiracies. Before Richards could respond to these accusations, a commotion outside his tent announced the arrival of complications that would transform the diplomatic meeting into a crisis requiring immediate action. Hayes himself had arrived at the military camp, apparently summoned by reports of unusual activity around the Apache checkpoint. The guide's appearance at the tent entrance created a moment of electric tension as he found himself face to face with the woman whose death he had been using to justify military intervention. Hayes's shock at seeing Sarah alive was immediately replaced by calculation as he realized the threat her survival represented to his larger conspiracy. "Captain, this woman has obviously been brainwashed by Apache captors," Hayes said quickly, his voice carrying the kind of desperate conviction that came from improvising crucial lies under pressure. They've dressed her in their clothing and coached her to tell stories that will undermine legitimate military operations. Sarah recognized the tactical brilliance of Hayes's response. By claiming she had been psychologically manipulated by her Apache rescuers, he was simultaneously explaining her survival and discrediting any testimony she might provide. The strategy exploited common prejudices about indigenous peoples while positioning himself as the voice of civilized authority. But Sarah had learned more than survival skills during her time with Joseph and his people. She had also learned the importance of exposing lies through strategic revelation of information that could be independently verified. "Captain Richards," she said calmly, "I suggest you examine Mr. Hayes's equipment and supplies. You'll find surveying instruments that no legitimate wagon train guide would possess, along with detailed maps of Apache territory that could only have been created through systematic intelligence gathering." The challenge forced Hayes into a defensive position, where his responses would either validate Sarah's accusations or expose him to further scrutiny. Richards, meanwhile, found himself in the position of having to choose between trusting his established source of information or accepting testimony that would require him to completely reassess the situation. The captain's decision revealed both tactical intelligence and moral courage. Instead of dismissing Sarah's claims or automatically supporting Hayes, he ordered an immediate inspection of the guide's possessions. The search revealed exactly what Sarah had predicted: professional surveying equipment, detailed territorial maps, and correspondence that documented the conspiracy's scope and organization. Most damaging was a letter from Colonel James Morrison, outlining payment schedules for intelligence gathering and explicitly instructing Hayes to create incidents that would justify military intervention in Apache territory. The document provided conclusive proof that the land seizure scheme involved official corruption and systematic fraud. Hayes's response to this exposure revealed the true nature of the forces Sarah and the Apache communities were fighting. Instead of attempting further deception, the guide drew a concealed weapon and attempted to eliminate both Sarah and Captain Richards before the evidence could be transmitted to higher authorities. The violence that erupted in the command tent was swift and brutal, but it was contained by the rapid intervention of Joseph and his Apache escorts, who had positioned themselves to respond to exactly this kind of treachery. Hayes's attempt at murder was prevented, but not before he had wounded Richards and demonstrated the conspiracy's willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operations. The failed assassination attempt transformed the military situation completely. Richards, despite his wound, now understood that he had been manipulated into providing federal cover for criminal activities. More importantly, the attack on a military officer by Hayes proved that the conspiracy was willing to target federal authority when it became inconvenient. But the crisis was far from resolved. The gunfire in the command tent had alerted the entire camp, creating confusion that the mercenary troops attempted to exploit by seizing control of military communications. Equipment. Their goal was clearly to prevent reports of Hayes's exposure from reaching territorial authorities, who might not be part of the conspiracy. Sarah found herself at the center of a three-way conflict between regular army personnel loyal to Richards, mercenary troops working for the conspiracy, and Apache warriors who had positioned themselves around the camp's perimeter. The survival of everyone involved now depended on her ability to help coordinate responses that could prevent the situation from exploding into general warfare. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that her unique position allowed her to serve as a communication link between Richards and the Apache forces. Using knowledge she had gained about both military and indigenous tactical approaches, she helped develop a coordinated response that isolated the mercenary troops while preserving the alliance between federal authority and Apache sovereignty. The operation required split-second timing and unprecedented cooperation between forces that had been trained to view each other as enemies. Regular army soldiers worked with Apache warriors to neutralize mercenary positions, while Sarah provided intelligence that allowed both groups to distinguish between legitimate and corrupt elements within the military camp. The success of this coordination depended entirely on the trust that had been built through her diplomatic mission. Richards's willingness to work with Apache forces was based on his recognition that Sarah's testimony had been validated by evidence he could verify independently. Meanwhile, Apache participation was motivated by White Dove's confidence that Sarah truly represented their interests. When the fighting ended, the conspiracy's military support had been eliminated and Hayes had been taken into custody, along with documentary evidence that would expose the full scope of the land seizure scheme. But the victory came at a cost that would reshape everyone's understanding of the challenges ahead. Captain Richards' wound was serious enough to require extended medical treatment, leaving the regular army forces without clear command authority. The mercenary troops, while defeated, had succeeded in destroying much of the military communication equipment, preventing immediate contact with territorial headquarters. Most critically, the violence had attracted the attention of other Apache bands, whose leaders might not accept White Dove's diplomatic approach. Sarah realized that her role as medicine person was about to be tested in ways that extended far beyond treating physical injuries. The trauma of betrayal, violence, and shattered trust would require healing that addressed spiritual and psychological wounds as well as physical damage. Both the innocent wagon train families and the Apache communities would need help processing experiences that challenged their fundamental assumptions about safety and justice. The convergence that had threatened to destroy both communities through violence had instead revealed possibilities for cooperation that could transform territorial relationships. But realizing those possibilities would require continued bridge building by someone who understood both the legal mechanisms that governed territorial development and the cultural values that motivated indigenous resistance. As dawn broke over the desert camp where former enemies had worked together to defeat a common threat, Sarah understood that her journey from tortured victim to diplomatic leader was entering its most challenging phase. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the larger questions about justice, sovereignty, and coexistence remained to be answered through the careful work of healing and reconciliation. The healing lodge that Sarah established in the days following the confrontation represented something unprecedented in territorial history, a place where white settlers and Apache people could receive treatment not just for physical wounds, but for the deeper traumas that had been inflicted by betrayal, violence, and the shattering of fundamental trust. Built in neutral ground between the military camp and the Apache settlement, the lodge served as a living symbol of the cooperation that had emerged from the crisis. Sarah's first patient was Captain Richards himself, whose bullet wound had become infected during the chaotic aftermath of Hayes's failed assassination. Treating a federal military officer required her to demonstrate medical competencies that went beyond the traditional healing knowledge she had been learning from White Dove. But her Boston education had included instruction in anatomy and basics, surgical techniques, knowledge that proved invaluable when combined with Apache understanding of medicinal plants and wound care. Working alongside Singing Bird, an Apache healer whose expertise with desert medicines complemented Sarah's formal training, they developed treatment protocols that drew from both medical traditions. The captain's recovery became a model for the kind of cultural synthesis that could benefit both communities when knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. "Your methods are unconventional, Miss Patterson," Richards observed, as Sarah changed his bandages using a mixture of imported antiseptics and traditional Apache remedies. But I cannot argue with the results. Healing requires using the best knowledge available, regardless of its source, Sarah replied. Apache people have been treating desert injuries for centuries. Their techniques work because they've been tested by generations of practical experience. The captain's gradual acceptance of indigenous medical knowledge represented a broader transformation in his understanding of territorial relationships. His official reports to federal authorities, written during his convalescence, provided an entirely different perspective on Apache capabilities and legitimate grievances than anything previously submitted by military personnel. But Sarah's most challenging cases were the families from the original wagon train, who had finally learned the full truth about Hayes's betrayal and the conspiracy that had endangered their lives. The Kowalski family struggled with the realization that their guide had been willing to sacrifice their children for personal profit. Marcus Webb faced crushing guilt over his failure to protect Sarah when Hayes had taken her from the camp. Each family required different approaches to processing trauma that challenged their basic assumptions about safety, justice, and the reliability of authority figures. Sarah found herself drawing not just on formal knowledge about psychological healing, but on her own experience of survival and transformation in the desert. "The betrayal you experienced was real," she told Elizabeth Thornton, whose trust in human nature had been shattered by Hayes's deceptions. "But so was your survival. The same strength that brought you through the desert can help you rebuild confidence in your ability to recognize trustworthy people." Working with these families also required Sarah to confront the painful reality that her own arranged marriage had been part of the larger conspiracy. Letters recovered from Hayes's possessions revealed that Jonathan Morrison had been specifically instructed to gather intelligence about Apache movements through his relationship with her. Her entire journey west had been orchestrated as an intelligence-gathering operation that had gone wrong when she proved more observant and independent than anticipated. The revelation forced Sarah to examine fundamental questions about identity and belonging that went beyond immediate survival concerns. She had been betrayed not just by Hayes, but by her own father, who had arranged her engagement, knowing it would place her in danger. The family she had thought she was traveling toward had never actually existed. But this painful discovery also completed her transformation from victim to healer. Understanding that she too had been manipulated and betrayed allowed her to work more effectively with others who had experienced similar trauma. Her healing practice became grounded in authentic empathy rather than theoretical knowledge. The establishment of formal diplomatic relationships between Apache communities and territorial authorities required months of careful negotiation, with Sarah serving as both translator and mediator. Her unique position as someone trusted by both sides allowed her to help develop agreements that addressed legitimate concerns while avoiding the legal traps that had been set by the conspiracy. The breakthrough came when Territorial Governor William Hayes, no relation to the disgraced guide, arrived to personally investigate the corruption that had been exposed. Governor Hayes was a pragmatic politician who understood that territorial stability required peaceful relationships with indigenous communities. More importantly, he possessed the authority to invalidate fraudulent land claims and establish new legal frameworks for protecting Apache water rights. "Miss Patterson," the governor said during one of their planning sessions, "your reports have exposed corruption that extends much higher than we initially realized. Colonel Morrison's activities were apparently known and approved by federal officials who saw territorial conflicts as opportunities for personal enrichment. The investigations that followed revealed a network of corruption that included territorial surveyors, federal land office personnel, and military officers who had been providing intelligence to private speculators. The exposure of this network led to prosecutions that went far beyond Hayes and his immediate conspirators. But Sarah's most important contribution to the resolution was her development of practical frameworks for ongoing cooperation between communities. Working with White Dove and other Apache leaders, she helped establish protocols for resource sharing that honored indigenous sovereignty while providing economic opportunities for white settlers. The water rights agreements they developed became models for territorial policy, establishing principles that water sources could be shared rather than exclusively controlled by single groups. The agreements also created enforcement mechanisms that prevented future fraudulent claims while providing legal protection for Apache territorial rights. These diplomatic successes were accompanied by personal transformations that surprised everyone involved. Marcus Webb, the young prospector who had initially supported Hayes's authority, became one of Sarah's most dedicated students in learning Apache survival techniques. The Kowalski family established a trading relationship with Apache communities that brought traditional foods to white settlements while providing manufactured goods to indigenous families. Most remarkably, Captain Richards requested assignment to permanent liaison duties between federal authorities and Apache leaders. His experience of working with Apache warriors during the crisis had convinced him that cooperation served military interests better than conflict. These people possessed tactical knowledge and territorial expertise that could benefit federal operations. Throughout the Southwest, Richards reported to his superiors, treating them as enemies wastes resources that could be used more productively in partnership. The healing lodge that Sarah had established grew into something approaching a permanent institution, serving not just immediate medical needs, but also educational functions that helped both communities understand each other's perspectives and capabilities. Apache children learned reading and arithmetic alongside traditional skills, while white families gained knowledge about desert survival and sustainable resource management. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Sarah herself, the sheltered Boston socialite who had boarded a wagon train expecting to begin a controlled, predictable life as a merchant's wife, had become someone whose identity was defined by service to communities that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Her marriage to Joseph Running Wolf, which took place according to both Apache and Christian ceremonies, represented more than personal happiness. It symbolized the kind of cultural bridge building that could create new forms of community identity based on shared values rather than exclusive ethnic loyalties. "You have become something that neither of our cultures had words to describe," White Dove observed during the wedding celebration. "You are proof that people can choose to become more than what their birth circumstances would suggest is possible." The couple's decision to establish their permanent home at the site of the Healing Lodge reflected their commitment to continued bridge building between communities. Their children would grow up speaking multiple languages and understanding multiple cultural traditions, representing the possibility of identities that transcended the boundaries that had historically divided peoples. As months passed and the new relationships matured, Sarah often reflected on the journey that had brought her. From torture victim to community leader, the transformation had required not just physical survival, but the willingness to abandon preconceptions about identity, capability, and the nature of civilization itself. The desert that had nearly claimed her life had instead revealed capabilities she never knew she possessed. The Apache people who her culture had taught her to fear had become her teachers, protectors, and ultimately her chosen family. The harsh landscape that had seemed like an enemy had become a home that she could not imagine leaving. But most importantly, Sarah had learned that healing, whether of individuals or communities, required more than treating symptoms. True healing addressed the underlying causes of trauma, fear, and mistrust that prevented people from recognizing their common interests and shared humanity. The territorial authorities who visited the Healing Lodge in its second year of operation found something they had not expected to see. Here was evidence that the conflicts that had characterized westward expansion were not inevitable consequences of cultural differences, but results of specific choices made by individuals who prioritized personal gain over community welfare. "Miss Patterson, Mrs. Running Wolf," Governor Hayes corrected himself during his final official visit, "your work here has implications that extend far beyond this territory. The cooperative relationships you've helped establish could serve as models for federal policy throughout the western regions." Sarah accepted the recognition with the same analytical perspective she had applied to survival in the desert. Individual success was meaningful only to the extent that it contributed to larger patterns of cooperation and mutual benefit. "The real achievement belongs to everyone who chose understanding over fear," she replied. "Apache leaders who were willing to trust outsiders, military officers who questioned their assumptions, families who learned to see past cultural differences, they are the ones who made this possible." As the sun set over the desert landscape that had witnessed her transformation from victim to healer, Sarah understood that her story was part of a larger narrative about the possibility of choosing cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and community building over individual acquisition. The cacti that had once served as instruments of torture now stood as silent witnesses to the healing lodge that had grown up around the water source they had helped her discover. The harsh landscape that had tested her will to survive had become a teacher that continued to reveal new lessons about adaptation, resilience, and the unexpected sources of strength that could be found in the most challenging circumstances. The Healing Lodge's influence expanded beyond immediate medical treatment as word spread throughout the territory about the unprecedented cooperation taking place there. Traveling merchants, territorial officials, and even foreign diplomats made special journeys to witness what many considered impossible: a thriving community where racial and cultural boundaries had been replaced by shared purpose and mutual respect. Dr. Amanda Hartwell, one of the few female physicians practicing in California, arrived from San Francisco specifically to study Sarah's integration of traditional and modern medical techniques. Her detailed documentation of the Healing Lodge's methods led to publications in Eastern medical journals that challenged prevailing assumptions about indigenous knowledge systems. "What you've accomplished here contradicts everything we've been taught about primitive medicine," Dr. Hartwell observed, while watching Sarah and Singing Bird collaborate on treating a complex bone fracture. "The precision of these traditional techniques suggests scientific understanding that predates European contact by centuries." The validation from established medical authorities helped legitimize the Healing Lodge's approaches while opening new opportunities for knowledge exchange. Sarah began corresponding with physicians and researchers across the country, sharing observations about desert medicine that contributed to broader understanding of regional healing practices. But the lodge's most profound impact was on the children who grew up within its sphere of influence. These young people developed capabilities that astonished adults from both cultures, moving fluidly between Apache and English languages, understanding both traditional ecological knowledge and formal scientific principles, and most importantly, viewing cultural diversity as a source of strength rather than conflict. 10-year-old Maria Kowalski could identify medicinal plants with the expertise of an Apache healer while explaining their chemical properties using terminology she had learned from Sarah's anatomy lessons. Thomas Webb, Marcus's younger brother, demonstrated tracking skills that impressed Apache scouts while maintaining detailed written records of animal behavior patterns that contributed to territorial wildlife studies. These children represented living proof that cultural synthesis could produce capabilities greater than either tradition could achieve independently. Their success attracted attention from educational reformers who saw in the healing lodges approach a model for schooling that could prepare young people for the multicultural realities of territorial expansion. Sarah's correspondence with educational authorities in Washington led to an invitation to testify before congressional committees investigating territorial policy. Her journey east, undertaken with Joseph and White Dove as cultural ambassadors, marked the first time Apache leaders had been invited to participate formally in federal policy discussions. The congressional hearings provided a platform for presenting evidence about the systematic corruption that had characterized territorial administration, but they also offered opportunities to demonstrate the viability of cooperative approaches to Western development. Sarah's testimony, supported by documented evidence of the Healing Lodge's success, influenced legislation that established new frameworks for indigenous relations throughout the expanding territories. The traditional approach to territorial expansion assumes that conflict between different peoples is inevitable, Sarah told the congressional committee. Our experience proves that cooperation serves everyone's interests more effectively than conquest, but only when it's based on genuine respect for different forms of knowledge and different ways of understanding the land. The federal recognition of the Healing Lodge as a model for territorial policy brought resources and official support that allowed its expansion into a comprehensive educational and medical institution. The Apache Federal Cooperation Institute, as it became formally known, attracted students and researchers from around the world who came to study successful methods of cross-cultural collaboration. Joseph's role in these developments evolved from scout and guide to formal diplomat, representing Apache interests in territorial and federal negotiations. His combination of traditional knowledge and sophisticated understanding of American political systems made him an invaluable advocate for indigenous rights throughout the Southwest. The couple's first child, a daughter they named Hope in English, and Dawnbringer in Apache, became a symbol of the possibilities that could emerge when cultural barriers were replaced by family bonds. Her birth was celebrated by both communities as evidence that their cooperation was creating something genuinely new rather than simply managing existing conflicts. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Sarah's transformation was its influence on how territorial expansion was understood and implemented in other regions. The success of the Apache Federal Cooperation Institute demonstrated that westward movement could proceed through negotiation and mutual benefit rather than conquest and displacement. Military commanders throughout the Western Territories began requesting assignment of personnel who had been trained in the Institute's cooperative approaches. These officers brought to their assignments understanding of how to work with indigenous communities as partners rather than obstacles to development. The economic benefits of cooperation proved as compelling as the moral arguments. Territories that implemented policies based on the Healing Lodge model experienced less violence, more stable development, and greater prosperity than regions that maintained traditional conquest approaches. Sarah's detailed records of medicinal plants and their applications led to the development of pharmaceutical compounds that benefited settlers and indigenous peoples alike. The commercial success of these medical innovations provided economic justification for continued investment in cooperative research and development. As the Healing Lodge entered its 5th year of operation, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of success and achievement had been transformed by her desert experience. The social accomplishments that had seemed so important in Boston proper marriages, fashionable connections, material accumulation, appeared trivial compared to the satisfaction of helping communities discover their capacity for mutual support. The scars on her arms from the cactus spines had faded but never completely disappeared, serving as permanent reminders of the torture that had initiated her transformation. She no longer viewed these marks as disfigurements, but as evidence of survival and the beginning of wisdom that could only be gained through direct confrontation with mortality and despair. Joseph often found her studying these scars during quiet moments, understanding that they represented more than physical healing. They were proof that the most profound growth often emerged from the most challenging circumstances, and that apparent destruction could become the foundation for reconstruction of identity and purpose. The annual gathering that commemorated the founding of the Healing Lodge brought together people whose lives had been touched by the cooperative model it represented. Former wagon train families, Apache leaders, military officers, territorial officials, and international visitors created a diverse assembly that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. Hayes, serving a life sentence for attempted murder and conspiracy, became an object lesson in how individual choices could either contribute to community welfare or destroy the trust that made cooperation possible. His transformation from respected guide to convicted criminal demonstrated that authority based on deception was ultimately unsustainable. The contrast between Hayes's fate and Sarah's achievements illustrated fundamental differences between approaches to power and influence. Where Hayes had used manipulation and violence to maintain control, Sarah had built authority through service and demonstrated competence that benefited everyone involved. The Healing Lodge's success attracted imitators throughout the Western Territories, but Sarah understood that genuine cooperation could not be replicated through superficial copying of techniques or structures. Each community required its own approach to building trust and developing mutual understanding between different cultural groups. Her consultations with other territorial communities focused on helping them identify their own resources for bridge building rather than imposing solutions that had worked elsewhere. This approach led to the development of multiple models for cooperation that were adapted to local conditions and cultural configurations. The network of cooperative communities that emerged from these consultations created new possibilities for regional development that transcended traditional territorial boundaries. Trade, education, and cultural exchange flowed along paths that connected indigenous communities, settler towns, and military installations in mutually beneficial relationships. Sarah's transformation from tortured victim to regional leader demonstrated that individual resilience could catalyze social changes that affected thousands of lives across vast geographical areas. But she never lost sight of the personal dimensions of her journey, understanding that lasting social change required individuals who were willing to risk everything for principles that extended beyond personal survival. The desert that had tested her will to live had become a teacher whose lessons continued to unfold with each passing season. Its harsh beauty served as a constant reminder that adaptation and cooperation were not just moral choices, but practical necessities for anyone seeking to thrive in challenging environments. The winter of Sarah's 7th year at the Healing Lodge brought unprecedented challenges that tested every lesson she had learned about adaptation and resilience. A severe drought reduced the water sources that both communities depended upon, creating pressures that threatened to revive old conflicts between Apache bands and settler families. The crisis demanded innovations that went beyond traditional cooperation into uncharted territory of resource management and environmental stewardship. Sarah's response drew upon knowledge systems that neither culture had fully developed independently. Working with Apache waterfinders and territorial engineers, She helped design conservation systems that captured and preserved seasonal rainfall through techniques that combined indigenous earthworking methods with modern hydraulic principles. The project required unprecedented levels of trust, as families from both communities contributed labor and resources to infrastructure that would benefit everyone equally. The success of the water conservation project attracted attention from territorial surveyors who were mapping routes for the transcontinental railroad. The railroad companies faced similar challenges in crossing arid regions, and they recognized the value of techniques that had been proven successful in the most demanding desert conditions. Sarah found herself consulting on engineering projects that would affect the development of the entire Southwest. Her influence on railroad planning ensured that indigenous communities were consulted rather than displaced during construction, creating employment opportunities for Apache workers while protecting sacred sites and traditional water sources. The railroad contracts that emerged from these negotiations became models for infrastructure development that served regional growth while respecting indigenous rights. The education programs that had begun at the Healing Lodge expanded into a comprehensive curriculum that attracted students from across the continent. Young people came to study what was now called territorial synthesis, the integration of different knowledge systems for practical problem-solving in challenging environments. Graduates of these programs became leaders in territorial administration, military services, and commercial enterprises throughout the expanding nation. Rebecca Hamilton, Sarah's cousin who had suffered the head injury during Hayes's initial assault, finally arrived at the Healing Lodge after years of recovery in Eastern medical facilities. Her reunion with Sarah provided an opportunity to witness firsthand the transformation that desert survival had wrought in someone she had known since childhood. "You've become someone I hardly recognize," Rebecca observed during their first private conversation. "The timid girl who worries about proper dinner conversations has become someone who shapes territorial policy and influences federal legislation." Sarah's response reflected the philosophical depth that her experiences had cultivated. The person you knew was shaped by circumstances that required timidity and conformity. The desert demanded different qualities, and discovering them changed everything about how I understand human potential. Rebecca's extended stay at the Healing Lodge resulted in her own transformation from Eastern socialite to documentary chronicler of cooperative frontier life. Her detailed journals and sketches provided invaluable records of daily life in a multicultural community, documentation that historians would later use to understand how successful integration actually functioned in practice. The arrival of European anthropologists and social theorists created new opportunities to share the Healing Lodge's innovations with international audiences. Professor Wilhelm Schneider from the University of Berlin spent 6 months studying what he termed practical multiculturalism, documenting methods that could be applied to ethnic tensions throughout Europe. These international connections led to correspondence with indigenous rights advocates in other countries who were facing similar challenges from colonial expansion. Sarah's letters to Maori leaders in New Zealand and Aboriginal representatives in Australia helped establish networks for sharing strategies that could protect indigenous communities while enabling beneficial cooperation with colonial societies. 2. Healing Lodge's reputation for medical innovation continued to grow as Sarah developed new treatments that combined desert plant medicines with emerging pharmaceutical techniques. Her research into pain management using cactus-derived compounds led to medical discoveries that benefited patients far beyond the territorial boundaries. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a researcher from Johns Hopkins Medical College, established a permanent research station at the Healing Lodge to study the intersection of traditional and scientific medicine. His work validated many indigenous medical practices while identifying the chemical mechanisms that made them effective, creating bridges between different approaches to healing that benefited both traditions. The agricultural experiments that grew from the Healing Lodge's resource management projects revolutionized farming in arid regions throughout the West. Techniques that combined Apache knowledge of desert ecology with immigrant farming methods produced crop yields that exceeded anything previously achieved in similar climates. These agricultural innovations attracted settlers who sought to establish sustainable communities, rather than extractive operations that depleted natural resources. The model of development that emerged around the Healing Lodge demonstrated that prosperity could be achieved through working with environmental conditions rather than attempting to overwhelm them through industrial force. Sarah's role in these developments evolved from healer and mediator to what contemporary observers called a territorial philosopher, someone whose ideas about cooperation and adaptation influenced policies and practices across multiple regions. Her writings on resource management, cultural integration, and sustainable development became required reading in territorial administration programs throughout the expanding nation. The economic prosperity that resulted from cooperative approaches attracted investment from Eastern financial institutions that had previously viewed the territorial frontier as too risky for major capital deployment. The stability created by successful integration of different communities provided confidence that supported railroad construction, mining operations, and commercial development that benefited all participants. But perhaps the most significant indicator of the Healing Lodge's success was the emergence of a new generation of leaders who took multicultural cooperation for granted, rather than viewing it as an exceptional achievement. Young people who had grown up in the integrated community assumed that diversity of knowledge and perspective was normal and valuable, and they carried these assumptions into their own leadership roles throughout the territory. Maria Kowalski, now 16 and fluent in 4 languages, established the first territorial newspaper to publish in both English and Apache, creating communication channels that kept diverse communities informed about developments affecting their shared interests. Her editorial approach emphasized common concerns rather than cultural differences, helping to maintain unity during periods of external pressure. Thomas Webb's mastery of both traditional tracking and scientific wildlife management led to his appointment as the territory's first indigenous-trained game warden, responsible for developing hunting and fishing regulations that balanced conservation needs with traditional practices and settler requirements. The children, born to Sarah and Joseph, represented the ultimate success of cultural synthesis. Hope Dawnbringer and her younger siblings moved seamlessly between different cultural contexts, serving as natural translators and mediators who helped resolve conflicts before they could escalate into serious disputes. Their multilingual capabilities and bicultural understanding made them valuable assets in territorial negotiations, trade relationships, and diplomatic communications with both federal authorities and neighboring tribal communities. Their success demonstrated that cultural integration could produce individuals whose capabilities exceeded what either tradition could achieve independently. The Healing Lodge's influence on military policy throughout the Southwest led to the establishment of cooperation protocols that prevented many of the conflicts that had characterized earlier territorial expansion. Officers trained in collaborative approaches achieved territorial objectives through negotiation and mutual benefit rather than conquest and subjugation. Colonel Richards, now promoted to territorial commander, implemented policies based on Healing Lodge principles throughout his jurisdiction. His success in maintaining peace while facilitating development, led to his approaches being adopted by military commands in other territorial regions. The transformation of territorial administration from conflict-based to cooperation-based approaches created new career paths for individuals who possess skills in cultural mediation and cross-community problem-solving. Sarah found herself training a new generation of territorial officials whose work would extend the Healing Lodge's influence far beyond its original location. As the Healing Lodge approached its 10th anniversary, territorial authorities commissioned a comprehensive study of its economic, social, and political impacts. The resulting report documented benefits that extended far beyond the immediate community, including reduced military expenses, increased agricultural productivity, improved health outcomes, and enhanced stability that attracted beneficial investment and development. The study's conclusions influenced federal policy discussions about how to manage the continuing expansion of American territory in ways that avoided the conflicts and costs that had characterized earlier frontier development. Sarah's testimony before federal commissions helped establish principles that would guide territorial policy into the next century. Her reflection on the decade since her escape from Hayes's torture revealed transformations that extended far beyond personal survival to encompass fundamental changes in how different communities could relate to each other and to the challenging environments they shared. The scars on her arms had become sources of strength rather than reminders of trauma, symbols of the capacity to endure suffering and transform it into wisdom that could benefit others facing similar challenges. The Healing Lodge stood as proof that individual resilience could catalyze social innovations that created possibilities for human flourishing in circumstances that had previously seemed to offer only conflict and scarcity. The establishment of the Western Territorial Medical College at the Healing Lodge represented the culmination of Sarah's vision for institutional change that could extend far beyond individual transformation. The college, jointly funded by federal appropriations and private donations from beneficiaries of the Lodge's innovations, became the first institution of higher learning designed specifically to integrate indigenous knowledge systems with conventional academic disciplines. Students arrived from universities across the nation to study what professors termed environmental medicine, the practice of healing that considered not just individual symptoms, but the broader ecological and social contexts that influenced health and disease. The curriculum included traditional Apache diagnostic techniques alongside modern anatomy, desert botany combined with pharmaceutical chemistry, and community health approaches that addressed psychological trauma as well as physical injury. The college's research programs attracted international attention from medical schools seeking to understand how traditional healing systems could enhance, rather than compete, with scientific medicine. Sarah found herself corresponding with researchers from the Royal College of Physicians in London, the Sorbonne in Paris, and medical universities throughout Germany who were documenting similar integrative approaches in their own colonial territories. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Spanish physician who had studied Aztec medical traditions in Mexico, established an exchange program that brought indigenous healers from throughout North America to share knowledge and techniques. These gatherings created the first systematic documentation of traditional medical practices across different tribal communities, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the rapid social changes accompanying territorial expansion. The college's pharmacy program developed standardized preparations of desert medicines that could be distributed to medical practitioners throughout the Western territories. Sarah's collaboration with pharmaceutical researchers led to the identification of active compounds in traditional remedies that would later become the basis for modern pain management and anti-inflammatory medications. But the medical college represented only one aspect of the institutional changes that grew from the Healing Lodge's success. The Territorial Mediation Service, established with Sarah as its founding director, provided conflict resolution expertise to communities throughout the Southwest, facing similar challenges in managing relationships between different cultural groups. The mediation services approach emphasized understanding the underlying interests that motivated apparent conflicts, rather than simply negotiating surface-level compromises. Sarah's teams included individuals trained in multiple cultural traditions, who could help different groups recognize their shared concerns and develop solutions that served everyone's fundamental needs. Cases handled by the mediation service ranged from water rights disputes between ranchers and indigenous communities to conflicts over land use between mining companies and traditional hunters. The service's success rate exceeded 90%, demonstrating that most apparently irreconcilable differences could be resolved when approached with sufficient cultural understanding and creative problem-solving. The territorial government's adoption of mediation as the preferred approach to inter-community conflicts reduced military expenses while improving relationships between different populations. The cost savings from avoiding conflicts funded additional social programs that benefited all territorial residents, creating positive feedback loops that strengthened cooperative approaches. Sarah's influence on territorial justice systems led to the establishment of multicultural courts that included representatives from different communities in legal proceedings affecting intergroup relationships. These courts developed new legal precedents that recognized indigenous property concepts alongside American law, creating frameworks for justice that honored different cultural approaches to resolving disputes. The legal innovations pioneered in the territory influenced federal policy discussions about how to manage the increasing cultural diversity that resulted from westward expansion and immigration from multiple countries. Sarah's testimony before congressional committees on territorial affairs helped establish principles that would guide American legal development for generations. The Healing Lodge's agricultural research programs expanded into comprehensive studies of sustainable development in arid environments. Partnerships with territorial universities created degree programs in desert ecology that prepared students to manage development projects throughout the expanding West without destroying the environmental systems that made long-term prosperity possible. These educational programs attracted students from around the world who faced similar challenges in managing development in challenging climates. Representatives from Australia, South Africa, and Argentina established exchange programs that shared techniques for sustainable agriculture, water conservation, and community development in arid regions. The international recognition of the Healing Lodge's approaches led to invitations for Sarah to consult on development projects throughout the American territories and beyond. Her travels to consult with communities in Texas, Colorado, and California spread cooperative development models across the expanding nation. The economic impact studies commissioned by territorial authorities revealed that regions implementing Healing Lodge principles consistently outperformed areas that maintained traditional conflict-based approaches to cultural differences. Agricultural, productivity, commercial development, and population growth all showed superior results in cooperative communities. These economic arguments proved compelling to business leaders and political officials who might have been skeptical of cooperation based purely on moral grounds. The demonstration that inclusive approaches produced superior financial results created support for cooperative policies among constituencies that prioritized practical outcomes over ideological considerations. The railroad companies that had initially consulted with Sarah about desert construction challenges became major advocates for cooperative development approaches. Their success in building transcontinental connections through negotiated agreements, rather than forced displacement of indigenous communities, demonstrated that large-scale development could proceed without the conflicts that had characterized earlier infrastructure projects. The establishment of the Transcontinental Cooperation Fund, supported by railroad profits and federal appropriations, provided resources for communities throughout the Western Territories to implement cooperative development projects based on Healing Lodge principles. This funding mechanism created financial incentives for peaceful resolution of cultural conflicts that might otherwise have escalated into expensive military interventions. Sarah's role in managing the Cooperation Fund required her to evaluate proposals from communities across the expanding nation, travel to oversee implementation of approved projects, and document successful approaches that could be replicated in other locations. This work expanded her influence far beyond the original Healing Lodge, while deepening her understanding of how cooperative principles could be adapted to different environmental and cultural conditions. The personal costs of this expanded influence included extended separations from Joseph and their children as Sarah traveled throughout the territories to establish new cooperative programs. These separations tested their marriage in ways that required the same commitment to communication and mutual support that had characterized their initial alliance during the crisis with Hayes. Joseph's own career as a diplomatic representative of Apache interests required similar travel and responsibility, creating scheduling challenges that demanded creative solutions for maintaining family relationships while serving broader community needs. Their children learned to understand that their parents' work served purposes larger than individual family preferences, developing maturity and independence that prepared them for their own leadership roles. Hope Dawn Bringer, now 12 years old, accompanied her parents on many consultation trips, serving as a living example of successful cultural integration while developing skills in mediation and cross-cultural communication that would define her own future career. Her ability to move seamlessly between different cultural contexts made her an invaluable asset in negotiations with communities that had never experienced successful cooperation. The younger children, Twin Stars, a son, and Mountain Song, a daughter, developed their own specialized interests in aspects of cooperative development. Twin Stars showed exceptional ability in engineering and construction projects that served multiple communities, while Mountain Song demonstrated remarkable talent for teaching and curriculum development that helped other communities establish their own educational programs. The family's annual reunions at the Healing Lodge became occasions for extended evaluation of cooperative programs throughout the territorial system. These gatherings brought together representatives from dozens of communities that had implemented Healing Lodge principles, creating networks of mutual support and knowledge sharing that strengthened the entire cooperative movement. The documentation of these network meetings provided invaluable data for researchers studying large-scale social change and community development. Universities throughout the nation sent graduate students to study the Healing Lodge model, creating a new academic discipline focused on cooperative community development. The publication of Sarah's comprehensive memoir, Desert Transformation: From Torture to Healing, became a foundational text for students of social change and conflict resolution. The book's detailed account of her personal journey from victim to leader provided insights into individual transformation while documenting the broader social innovations that had emerged from personal crises. The memoir's international distribution influenced social reform movements throughout the world, providing practical examples of how individuals could catalyze community changes that addressed seemingly intractable conflicts between different cultural groups. Translations into multiple languages spread Healing Lodge principles to reformers facing similar challenges in other countries and contexts. As Sarah approached her 20th year at the Healing Lodge, territorial authorities commissioned a comprehensive assessment of the cooperative movement's impact on Western development. The resulting study documented transformations that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the original participants. Territories that had implemented cooperative approaches showed dramatically reduced rates of violence, higher levels of economic prosperity, more stable population growth, and greater satisfaction among residents from all cultural backgrounds. The success of cooperative development had transformed the American approach to territorial expansion from conquest-based to partnership-based methodologies. The federal adoption of cooperative principles as official policy for new territorial acquisitions represented the ultimate validation of the Healing Lodge's influence on American development. Sarah's consultation role in developing these federal policies ensured that lessons learned from desert survival would guide the nation's expansion into new regions and relationships with indigenous peoples throughout the continent. Her final reflection on the transformation that had begun with Hayes's torture revealed the profound truth that individual resilience, when combined with commitment to serving others, could catalyze social changes that affected the lives of thousands of people across vast geographical and cultural boundaries. The desert that had tested her will to survive had become the foundation for innovations that would influence American development for generations, proving that the most important treasures were indeed those that could be shared rather than hoarded, and that the greatest adventures were those that opened new possibilities for human connection across every boundary that fear and prejudice had tried to make permanent. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.